not good for journalism, but like, I don't.
I mean, maybe. I think it's just like professional bad luck.
Okay, so maybe we should start. The doors are open, so everyone clearly knows what's going on. Okay, perfect. So I think I'll just introduce people. So this is Daniel Molenkamp, brother of David Molenkamp.
Howdy.
So Daniel Molenkamp is an independent journalist who graduated from college 2 years ago from William Mary in Virginia, and since then he's been researching all sorts of things I've also been finding out right now. But amongst others, he's researched into the Catalan referendum. He arrived the day after the referendum on October 1st was announced, or literally took place, and spent a month or how long?
A little over a week.
A little over a week. And so, I know personally I wasn't there, so I will be super excited. I'll introduce myself. So my name is Jan. I'm a senior majoring in biomechanical engineering.
Not to worry. You did.
It's on. And yeah, so I'm involved in the European Association, and I'll let other people introduce themselves too.
Hey everyone, I'm Celio. I'm a senior in symbolic systems. I also am on the board of the European Association.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a senior majoring in political science, and I'm part of the European Security Undergraduate Network.
I'm Al. I'm interested.
Reita Ibáñez, I am from Barcelona, visitor family of postdoc, and I am interested. I think this is another conference more open, but if you accept, I agree.
I'm David. I'm a junior studying history, and I'm Daniel's brother, but I'm also interested in the topic somewhat.
I'm Jordi. I'm from Barcelona, and I'm a sophomore majoring in history.
I'm Anat. I'm a sophomore majoring in history, and I'm part of the European Security Undergraduate Network.
I'm Seema. I'm a junior majoring in political science, and I'm also part of this.
I'm Ben. I'm a junior majoring in history and also part of this.
I'm Mar. I'm a postdoc in the School of Medicine, and I'm from Barcelona.
So we thought that Daniel maybe wanted to start us off. So I don't know how updated people are. We don't know each other from class. So Daniel, he prepared something, and but he said it was okay if we interrupt as well.
Yeah, I mean, please do interrupt. This is not like a lecture. I'm not so free to interrupt your flu or a cat call or whatever. Well, I mean, thanks for that kind introduction, Jan, earlier, and thanks for graciously organizing this event, all you who were involved with the organizations that did. And thanks for coming, guys, though I have a sneaking suspicion that some of you came more for the free food than the free words. You can never be too sure. As I understand it, I'm here more as an independent journalist and a professional interloper than a regional expert. But I think hopefully I'll have some relatively provocative things to say that you guys can at least bump your heads up against me and trying to form your own opinions on the Catalan referendum. But I'm basically here to say that this is something that you should be paying very close attention to if you weren't paying any attention at all, and even closer attention if you were paying some attention. So if I fail at any of this admittedly ambitious goals, you can kind of grab me while I'm here and talk to me afterwards. And I guess that's enough ingratiation. Let's try this. So one of the points of contention when I was in the region in the days immediately following the initial referendum vote on October 1st, especially for the Spanish functionaries and the supporters of the Spanish functionaries, was the claims and accusations of Spanish violence. And that was something which the editor for the little essay I did for Diplomatic Courier wanted to be especially cautious about. And so the first thing I'd like to say is that I think that Spanish violence and that there was Spanish violence is beyond contestation. There's no possibility for doubting it. For one thing, there's video footage of Spanish violence. For another thing, there was hospital and medical reports released to journalists and observers. There are numerous reports from numerous organizations that you can check out. Human Rights Watch's report on that is one I would recommend. Still, I noticed that the foreign minister, Spain's foreign minister, was throwing around phrases in the press, especially the British the UK press, alternative facts and fake news, which immediately drew the connection to me to first Ukrainian and Russian ordeal, which is relatively fresh still, and also the rise of Donald Trump here in the U.S., where we're supposed to be in some kind of post-fact world. And it's a connection that I had noticed earlier in the U.S., and so part of what I'm trying to do here is draw a connection across nationalist and right-wing resurgence across Europe and also across North America. And those are the primary areas I'm going to stick to. But I had a hard time, the best way I've been able to phrase it is this: I've had a very hard time convincing people about 2-3 years ago that that globalism was not inevitable. I mean, I would say the Fukuyama thesis was like pretty well settled. I mean, it was a question of is it Fukuyama or is it Huntington? We know liberal democracy won. We know that globalism is on the rise and that it's inevitable and cannot be rolled back. I was trying to say bullshit at the time. I think I've been somewhat vindicated by this, and certainly there are more impressive scholars saying the same thing now as me. For example, Now Ferguson, for example, I think he wrote the essay saying borders are back right now, a couple months ago, about 6 months ago. So before I get into the meat of that case, can I get like a hand, like who considers themselves relatively updated on the referendum? Like how much do I need to unlay here? So cozy. Okay, so I would say let's start with let's start at the referendum date, and I'll assume some familiarity with Catalan politics generally, and if we need to, we can get into that.
Actually, if I can intervene, one thing I'm curious about and somehow was not able to find out was whether the referendum was recognized by Spain prior to it. So, was Spain officially said that it was aware that the referendum was taking place and that it was going to heed its results?
No, so Spain, so Madrid and I think Trump, they did a joint press conference days before, basically saying that it was, not only was it illegal, which the Spanish Constitution Court said, but that they would not uphold it, but very specifically, this is illegal, we don't think it's so legitimate, we think it's essentially a coup, and Trump backed their play on that one, which for some reasons I'll explain later, I think is kind of interesting, given his rise. I think it's the same sentiments that animated his success in the U.S. and some of these tendencies. So for the referendum, October 1st, the vote happens. Immediately there's violence. There was accusations that votes were confiscated. There was certainly clashes between protesters and police. Voters were turned away. There was an arrest of members of parliament who were seen as sponsoring the illegal vote. Nearly 2 days after the referendum, in which something like 90% voted for yes, though there's a question as to whether or not that should actually be seen as representative, because when the leadership of the country comes down and starts setting out the police and declares something illegal, you're very likely going to drive away a lot of section of voters that would have been pro-Spain, right? So about 2 days after the referendum, you have major strikes within the city, and there was some protests and counter-protests expressing pro-Spain and pro-independence sides both. But more than that, it was a takeaway for a lot of journalists. This has kind of sparked a regional and constitutional crisis. Constitutional because it essentially goes all the way back to the end of the Franco regime, and to what constitutes legitimacy within the region. So what exactly is the limits of the autonomy of Catalonia? Like what can they push for? And of course it harked back to elements that have been there previously. For example, there was some measures in 2006 which were struck down in 2010 by the Spains that would have privileged would have increased Catalonia's autonomy. They wanted things like privileging of the Catalan language, for example. And so that if that was spitting in the eye of the Catalans, striking those things down, which they had legitimately voted, I think this move was more like kicking them in the shin. It was pushing them down, essentially.
So the way I understand it is that the separatists tend to emphasize the cultural sort of side to it, and the people who want Spain to be unified, well, often they literally have political motivations like outside of Spain too, but within Spain it's mainly, they say that Catalonia wants to break off because of financial reasons.
Yes.
But that also makes sense. That makes sense too. That's also somewhat like a reason for Catalonia to break off, even though there will be larger implications then too, and not only the EU and problems, but.
I've definitely heard that case. I think my view is a little different. My view is that that probably was the reason it was taxing purposes. I think the economists estimated the difference between what Catalonia sends to Madrid in terms of taxes and gets back in services from Madrid is like 10 billion euro a year, which is like a hefty portion of the GDP of Catalonia, which is one of the largest GDPs within that region, or within Spain generally. So that's nothing to scoff at, but my view is this is probably a bad move ultimately. The case on the pro-independent side is usually has to do with they use the culture to reinforce this idea that there is a pre-existing autonomy for Catalans.
So they tend to emphasize that that since 2010, that like you just said, in 2010 they thought that Spain spat into their face, kind of by making the official language not Catalan but Spanish, and not recognizing, amongst others, I think. But on the other hand, the other people also say that Catalonia has gained more independence since 1978. So they're saying that,
which is true, but only kind of relevant. So if the trends, if you draw the historical lines from like 78, the death of Franco generally, 1775 to 2010, it's true that they gained increasing autonomy because they were being punished for being anti-Francoist under the Franco regime, which is why you had the illegality.
So it's a dumb thing to say.
No, it's not a dumb thing to say. It's actually a true thing to say, but it's like only kind of relevant. So the only legitimate case I see for the Catalans in terms of the language is that they're saying, look, we have a pre-existing culture, which actually predates Spain itself. It goes all the way back to like Isabella and Ferdinand, many centuries back. It's been an autonomous region. It was basically kind of illegally brought under the fascist regime under Franco and punished for fighting that. And then in 2006, from about 2006, they're trying to push for increasing amounts of autonomy. They want small concessions like language, which is meant obviously to push them towards being a more autonomous region. And Spain rejects that under the claim that the 78 Constitution basically means indissoluble. At least that's the thing they used to strike down this referendum. But I think you can make a moral case, or at least a political one, from a kind of comparative perspective that's a very suspect claim, especially since it derives directly from the fall of Franco, which was something they didn't like in the first place, and which I think you could make the case is some kind of international crime under Franco. So I think but I do have a lot of sympathy for the pro-Spain side within the Catalan region. Definitely, I think their case might be stronger. This is actually a very bad move for Catalans. You've already seen the flight of a lot of businesses because any instability in a region will overturn the economy basically anytime. It's the same thing I saw in South Sudan. So without a baseline of development and peace, you don't have business interests, and you have brain drain and a bunch of other things like that. And so what they're worried about is that, true, you may not be sending over a lot of taxes, but the EU has made it very clear that you have to reapply for membership, which seems unlikely, highly unlikely. If Spain
but also it's in the EU's interest. But would they break up, then I'm sure they figure out what's in their interest then.
Right. So the last news report I saw was a Puigdemont calling for actually a referendum on whether or not you should even stay in the EU, which is again a terrible political decision because it's going to alienate all of the conservatives behind him right now, and I think it also ruins the moral superiority that he had.
He keeps citing Slovenia. Which is 1990, which is so long ago, and it's
I think, I mean, it's been a while since there's been like a major crackdown of an internal EU country, for sure. I saw some people were drawing parallels to Yugoslavia.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was much more violent, but, sorry.
Well, I just wanted to ask about referendums in general. So The Economist had an article recently where they talked about the possibility of Russia having meddled in the Brexit referendum. And I'm kind of wondering like what you call like this post-fact world, and like, where we don't know things, perhaps you don't want to know, or perhaps it's high security clearance or whatever. Like, do voting referendums have weight? Does it really? I'm skeptical that the will of the people still means the same thing. I don't know if this is perhaps too big of a topic, but this is bringing it up.
So that definitely feeds into the case being made by the pro-independent side. They say this, it depends on how you read is this the will of the people or not? I said I already think there's reason to suspect that Spanish meddling has kind of changed the will of the people. As for the post-fact rule, I actually kind of dispute the way that that's thrown around a little bit. I don't think the impact of meddling has been quite as significant as people make out just generally. I think the best way I've heard it phrased is like, if this is the post-fact world, when was the fact world? Like, when was the area when everyone privileged truth and justice and the will of the people? Obviously never. So I would say generally it's overblown, and my concern in those kind of narratives is that it, at least in the U.S. And elsewhere in the EU too, the onus falls a lot on private corporations to settle the question. So like Facebook needs to police its own. Twitter needs to learn how to ideologically police its. So there's some ads on some YouTube videos we don't like. Well, YouTube needs to change its algorithm, and I think they've proven very bad at doing that, and they're also not incentivized at doing anything that doesn't lead to profits. Basically, private corporations exist for private profit, and full stop. That's it. They can't take over governmental institutions like that.
But you think it's their job as private companies and not policymakers?
No, I don't think it's their job. I think the trend is to put it on them, and they've proven very, very inept at doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's much more of a danger than the actual threat posed by like Russian farms that are creating fake content. Disputable, but that's my view. In terms of drawing the connection between this and the other regions, let's see. First, let me finish. Where did we leave off on we were in like October 2nd, right? Let's see if I can find a way of doing this relatively quickly. Here we go. So October 3rd, strikes and protests permeated the city. Following that, Madrid threatened to rescind the Catalan self-rule and autonomy, which was an unprecedented move. Unless the referendum was disavowed. Of course, the referendum was not disavowed. They voted in favor of upholding the referendum, but then immediately suspended it. And so this led to a bunch of other fights. But just to footnote that, I think this actually shows that there was a slight misinterpretation on Spain's part of what was actually going on in the referendum, because they did not declare independence. It was a non-binding referendum, which was immediately suspended. So it was not enacted. But Spain nonetheless acted as if they had declared independence, which is why they were able to jail members of parliament, including the vice president, which is a member of the executive.
What do you mean by active?
They dissolved the parliament. They fired the upper leadership of the Catalan executive, and they jailed several members, which is what led to the flight of Puigdemont into Brussels, which is Belgium.
So since they didn't want to uphold the referendum, what evidence did, because I think they kept using Article 155.
Yes.
They kept saying, and which is a very kind of vague article
Yes.
too, it's never been used. It just says that if anything is done in any region in Spain that might threaten the stability of the whole country, then they're allowed to take power, which basically means that the main government can always take power.
Sure. So what we're delving into is like the legal divisions. I would say I'm not a legal expert. From my journalistic side, what I saw was the explanations they were giving was they were saying that Catalonia had declared independence, which is just not true. That's the narrative that they were spinning in the press. So it might have been legally and technically true that they could do it, but it was unprecedented, and it definitely raises into question their calls, because they were making the case forever that actually the Francoist members were the pro-independence because they were trying to overthrow Spanish democracy. Well, that's a very hard case to make when you're dissolving parliaments and jailing members of an executive. And it definitely would push, I think it pushed some observers like me more towards Catalan than we would have been otherwise, even though I think it's a bad move.
So do you think it's a bad move to draw the independence?
I think it was initially, yeah.
To clear the sentence,
I think it's a bad move for the reason I kind of alluded to, which is that it's going to drive a lot of business and economics away. So if the main point was to improve your economy and retain more money in it, which was presumably what they wanted with the tax rates, that's not very good, especially if you have to look at the question of whether or not you can remain in the EU. Anyway, to cut this rambling story short, by October 27th, basically the negotiations had failed. Puigdemont was in Belgium, where he still is, trying to run his campaign. So he's simultaneously trying to elude a arrest warrant for him. So basically, Belgium is reviewing the arrest warrant from Spain to determine whether or not they should extradite him back to Spain for sedition. And I believe it was for sedition and rebellion, which is what the other members are being jailed on. And he's simultaneously doing that, and he's trying to run his campaign for re-election to the upper echelon of Catalonia in the upcoming election, which takes place, I believe, on December 21st. Meanwhile, Madrid is pushing its own candidates, and this is the vote that they've basically said they're going to heed, or they've indicated that they're going to heed. The very, very latest polls that I saw, which were sent to me this morning by some people in Barcelona, showed that about 46-46 pro versus they're hovering right around there. So the claims that the wind of secessionism has kind of been ripped or deflated from Barcelona seems suspect to me. I mean, you can make the case, but I think it's about half right now. It could go either way, depending. I think when we see the latest questions over whether or not they should remain in the EU is definitely going to hurt the secessionist movement and help unity movements generally. But I suppose we'll see. This is being framed as a reset for the region.
Daniel, sorry for interrupting. Just going back to the point of whether Catalonia intended this as a binding, seeking independence movement, or just checking what the public is saying. As you said, maybe its legal format was just to see the public opinion.
Sure.
But after the referendum, the Catalonian president said, and I quote, "On this day of hope and suffering, Catalonia citizens have earned the right to an independent state in the form of a republic."
Sure.
So Spain's reaction is perhaps not disproportionate to the referendum, in not violence-wise, but in the sense that it acted as if it was an act of coup d'état and claiming
My
independence.
first counterpoint to that would be that the Spanish violence happened before he said that.
But that was in the referendum, which Spain said it was illegal in the first place.
Sure, which raises the whole question again. So it's definitely, I'm not trying to push the pro-independence movement. I would say they definitely acted suspect too, and that I think probably what was going on was that they were trying to do a couple of things. First, bargain and jockey for position within the Catalan Parliament. There's been a lot of charges of corruption on both sides. There's a famous corruption case which was the report to which was read in the Catalan Parliament in October at some point, and I've seen some essays in places like The Nation magazine which are claiming that actually pretty much this whole thing was an idea to rebrand both sides, the conservative and liberal side, to avoid corruption charges and things like that. So there's a lot going on and seething under the surface for sure.
Doesn't that almost sound like conspiracy theory though? If violence,
almost, yeah.
If like police violence was employed supposedly to cover up corruption, that sounds crazy.
Yeah.
That sounds just unreal.
Sure. I think well, to be fair to the Nation journals, I don't think that's quite what they're claiming. I think what they're claiming is in some ways crazier, in some ways not so crazy. It's that there's this kind of systemic rot of collusion between the Spanish courts generally and some members of the Conservative Party, which are revealed through this case. I won't say that. I don't think that's necessarily true.
So the deep state.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think that's the Nation's bias. Also, my contacts in Barcelona also live there. I don't think that's true, even though they've been following the case. But I think what is true and what can be drawn from that is some of the conclusions that they draw anyway, which is that this is basically a golden opportunity to rebrand the entire system. And I think that's what you've seen. So you see pro-independence movements redrawing lines, redrawing maps, the same thing on the secession side. So whether or not there's corruption, I don't know or really care, since I'm not a tax-paying member of Barcelona. But it's definitely very interesting, for sure, and worth attending to.
Yeah, so based on your perspective, where do you think this is going? Like, do you think that the referendum, the second vote that you alluded to at the beginning of this talk, is actually going to succeed? And if so, what are the consequences of that?
I think it's a toss-up right now. I think it's less likely to succeed than it would, just because of some of the recent statements and turmoil. The consequences of it succeeding would be to energize nationalist and separatist movements across Europe, which is part of what I was trying to say in the essay, is that I think all these things are connected. The consequence of it failing, at least as the pro-Spain side is pushing it, would be that it kind of reset the clock for them. But I think it's in danger of happening again, because let's say that they revote. They revote Parliament. They kick out all the members. They jail everyone that they want to. Well, it seems like there's going to be some historically pro-independence elements still in the Parliament, with like a rough majority of control. So who's to say they couldn't just revisit this in about 5 years? So that's what I think would be the consequence for that. I think before 2016 generally, so before Brexit, before Trump, things like that, it would have been really hard to point to some kind of moral or ideological symbolic victory for secessionist movements. But I think if you just look across at the rise of right wing and the rise of separatist movements across Europe and across the US, you see like a massive increase. And I think part of that is the consequence of Trump and Brexit, because these can be pointed to as definite victories for anti-globalist regimes. So things like Breitbart, if you go back and read a lot of the Breitbart articles before Trump becomes elected, and like look what did they actually say that they want? They basically try and set up this distinction between globalist and anti-globalist, and they view the anti-globalist as this like secret colluding force which somehow sells out the nation, to globalist forces that aren't necessarily in interest. And so I think that's all relevant to keep in mind generally. There was a Chatham House study that was done before Donald Trump was elected, which looked at the question of, essentially looked at the Muslim ban. This was before the Muslim ban was actually announced, but it looked across Europe at, I think, 10 states, including Spain, including Italy, and a couple others. And essentially the question they were asking was, would you support a ban of influx of refugees from certain select Muslim countries? And it was yes. It was mostly yes. So that I think though there's a lot of like pearl clutching and name calling in Europe and things like that, especially over things like the Muslim ban, I think part of what led to Trump getting to rise in the first place was this idea that the refugees are threatening our economic order, they're threatening our security, and you see this basically all over. The connection for me on the U.S. side, because that's what I'm more familiar with, let's stick there for a second. On the U.S. side, the connection was made much direct by some of the Trump campaign in like the early days. So there was, I want to say it was in February, Jeff DeWitt, who's Arizona and treasurer, and he was also highly active in Donald Trump's campaign. And he made a statement saying that there was, that he saw a couple of things, including ISIS coming up through the Mexican border. I remember thinking this because I was at Homeland Security at the time, and I thought, I think I would have heard, like, this is basically what I'm researching. I'm with the teams here looking at foreign fighters and ISIS and things like that. I haven't seen a single report of that. It turns out not true, obviously. There was not a single evidence of that, but it connected the issues in the minds of everyone. And it's partially what the Great Wall of America is supposed to guard against, right? I mean, that's why the Chinese built their Great Wall, was to keep the Mongols out. For me, there's like a very obvious, you said you were doing human biology? So there's a very good metaphor for this in the way that people think of nationalism. And so I think a lot of these people tend to think of nationalism as an extension of your human body. And so what that means is that it's a very fragile thing which can be infected by like ideological parasites. And foreign fighters is one of those things that I think activated that. Because the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda was that whereas Al-Qaeda was being trained in the Middle East and then flown in, ISIS members who adhere to ISIS basically radicalize themselves. So they see propaganda, they decide that they're going to radicalize, and then they just carry out an attack. They have no direct connections often to it, so it's very hard to suss out, and it's also based on propaganda, which the U.S. is very, very bad at. And so I think that's what they're worried about, this ideological contagion. So when you connect that element to the economy, which is what a lot of the concerns are, especially places here like California, not the Bay Area, but maybe more Southern California or anywhere closer to the border, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, places like that. If you talk to a lot of conservatives who would have voted for Trump, and you just like figure out what is it they actually want, why is it that they think they voted for Trump? Because presumably they don't think they voted for Trump because they're racist, right? That's just not how people think. Well, it's the economy, it's terrorism. It was call it by its actual name, right? You have to call it radical Islamic terrorism because you're soft on terrorism if you don't call it that. And it was the economy. He was going to bring back and restore manufacturing jobs. Of course, that's slightly ridiculous because even the people who recommend reviving the manufacturing sector in America will openly admit that it's probably past the point of revival, and that all you can do is slow down the death process. But it's things like that and it's connections like that. And I think the Chatham House study, which was kind of for the Muslim ban, is a good way of pointing out, well, actually that exists parallel. And of course, there's things like the migrant quotas and the migrant prices, which Hungary and Poland, among others, tried to fight off. I'm sure some of you know this. They were rejected. Their claims that they didn't have to belong to this migrant quota system were rejected in a process that usually isn't used when the question of national sovereignty is involved. So their case was basically, well, we're sovereign nationally, and we don't have to take these migrant quotas.
I think the Czech Republic did something similar.
The Czech Republic, I think it was supported by Poland, but the Czech Republic and Hungary were listed names on the complaint.
Slovakia issued a separate complaint that withdrew it.
Yeah.
And Austria is in non-compliance.
Yeah. So that again, you have the same issues all across the board.
And so a quote which I think is interesting is the non-separatists keep saying democracy is not being able to vote, democracy is the rule of law. And so they kind of use that, I feel, to defend the police violence, even though they also downplay it massively. I haven't seen it, you have. I've only seen videos. And then they also, the referenda that were done, basically all the referenda are not recognized. The only thing that's recognized is that at some point, so there are political parties who are pro-separation and against separation, and the national government recognizes those elections, obviously. And so at 1.48% of the votes went to pro-separation parties. That's the only thing that's recognized by the non-separatists, by Madrid.
Yeah.
And so do you think that any of the referenda should be recognized after 2010? Because there are many of them.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, that's a.
And why? So clearly, the Spanish government also has its own interests. They do want to keep Catalonia part of Spain, no matter what. That's the feeling that I get. And because if they would want to, they would have set up. They also partially don't recognize the referenda because they're counted out by the people who want it to turn out as a yes. So that decreases their credibility. But if they would really want it, they'd also set up a referendum themselves.
Yeah, I think they could have very easily oversaw what they would consider a legitimate referendum. I think that for me the sick man of Europe is European cooperation. So to speak. So there's like no cooperation at any level, and that's the real problem. So should they have recognized any of the referendum? Probably not now. I mean, it doesn't make much sense now to go back and justify them unless they're looking for some kind of symbolic victory. I think they could very have easily given some small concessions. My own personal view was that some of the members who were pushing the pro-independence, at least initially, actually didn't want independence. What they wanted was better tax rates, and Spain could have easily found some kind of bargain that would have taken enough wind out of it that they couldn't have passed it.
But why? So why were they so stubborn? Why did they not go for the bargain? Because by not going for the bargain, they raised this uproar, which also hurts.
Yeah, I honestly just think it's partially mishandling. Also, I think it's partially is a general sentiment in Europe that you don't want to give any ground to people like this. So like Italy is facing a very similar thing right now. I think Lombardy and Veneto.
But isn't it justified to give them some ground?
I think so. But that
This is dangerous.
Yeah.
It's like the domino. I don't know.
I think it's because it's a right extreme party what is governing Spain, and this is the main problem sometimes, because if you see the election when we vote all together for the Spanish central government, Catalonia is a region that votes more pro pro-left-wing parties. So this tells you something about the different people that lives in different regions. So we are more pro-left ideas. And if we have a central government that is so right-wing, I don't know, it just shocks a little bit. I don't know.
Well, I mean, imagine that you're running Spain and you have a very I'm sure you know, if you're in a political position, you don't listen to everybody ever under any circumstances. You have a very small cadre of people that you know I need their support. So if you're in charge of Spain right now, probably you have a small cadre of very conservative parties, like she says. You also have members of the EU, people like Macron, who are telling you don't give an inch to these people because they have at their door their own nationalist separatists, and so all you're hearing is don't do it, don't do it, don't do it.
But then you have the right of autodetermination, which Europe, in theory, has in its rights human rights. So the humans we have the right to autodetermine, at least in Europe.
Yeah.
So where is this autodetermination right?
Yeah.
So if Europe, it's hypocrisy, okay, you can just say that, but it doesn't make sense.
Well, it's not just hypocrisy, it's systemic rot. So like if you look at the UN, I think suffers very similar problems. So the big test case that the UN failed, in my opinion, was over the Ukrainian-Russian situation, where they refused to back Ukraine, which would have certainly, under any feasible interpretation I've heard, it would have definitely increased their effort for nuclear non-proliferation, right? So they're making this nuclear non-proliferation argument. That's supposed to be one of their overarching principles. You have a country which is basically following that above and beyond Ukraine, and then the second that they get into trouble with Russia, what do? You turn your back. So the lesson there for me is, if I'm Ukraine, is, well, next time you don't turn your back away from the nuclear weapons, you get the nuclear weapons first, and then you start playing around. I think that's exactly what we see with North Korea, for example. Same lesson is from Iraq. The international community would be a lot more cautious in dealing with you if they know you have nuclear weapons than if you don't. But the UN's failed at every systemic, I think, charge that it has. So stopping genocide, they're terrible at it. Very, very, very bad. Nuclear non-proliferation, they're extremely bad. And this is partly over the question of national sovereignty, because they're built on a national sovereignty model, but the questions that they're looking at are above national sovereignty. So like, it doesn't really make sense to address global poverty within the context of sovereignty, because it's not confined to borders. Same thing for non-proliferation, for genocide prevention. In fact, genocide prevention and non-proliferation actually require violation of national sovereignty, which is something that's never been totally kosher under that. And so the same thing, I think the same thing applies to economic cooperatives or any kind of cooperative broad scale, is that you have to work with the players that you have. And it's not immediately clear how you address questions like this. So you have that, and then on the other hand, you have other problems which are just becoming emergent, like massive megalith corporations, for example. Google being a good example. We're in Silicon Valley right now. So collection of data and things like that are existential threats to countries, as far as I'm concerned. But they don't really have a way. So like, how does a country like Spain deal with Google? Like, how can you shut down Google when it's bigger than you? It's bigger than national. It's above national. And so there's that question. And in the meantime, in the U.S., we haven't even decided whether or not we like the global order or not, even though we're at the head of it. So you have guys like Bannon who are in fights right now for control of the Republican Congress, which is fighting itself and trying to purge itself. We're pushing very, very old school style national sovereignties.
And so is Google, for example, aiding globalization, or is it kind of helping secularization?
So I think it's aiding globalization in the sense that it's making everything more connected. It's in tension with the global order, though, I would say, because it does have a lot of tension. So if you look at the way that it's dealing right now with the EU, it doesn't seem to me that that's going to work out necessarily well for anyone involved. And then there are some more idiosyncratic ones that aren't necessarily tied to big single megalith corporations, like concern over the rise of AI and stuff like that, right? Obviously has implications for these things. And definitely if you're tying economics together between countries, how one country, like say Germany, deals with AI technology will definitely differ from like how somewhere like Spain or Italy might deal with it, and that'll create tension. So I think there's a lot of inherent tension. Saudi Arabia, by the way, not a lot of people know this, but they should. Saudi Arabia, I think, granted citizenship to AI. Yeah.
Yes.
First country to do so.
What does that mean?
They granted full citizenship.
It's a citizen.
there's a robot called Sophia who has artificial intelligence, and like it almost looks human,
Oh my god.
and like it's very conversational, and like Saudi Arabia granted our citizenship.
And then, so I think there's some very interesting implications, especially when you consider like what's the difference between. So for me, the difference between like me and a lobster, say, is just a few lines of code, so to speak. It's like it's human sequencing, basically genome sequencing. So with technology like CRISPR and the human sequencer and the genome project, the difference is made like palatable and saleable because things like Google are able to take information in mass quantities, and basically they're able to make it into a commodity. So the commodity is the consumer. It's not the other way around. So now, if you can imagine having pools of like human sequence genome. And being able to sell that information would be like selling the essence of what it means to be X or Y. So the difference between like a robot and a human being might not actually be that meaningful in terms of law, or at least in terms of the market.
Just to bring it back to the voting referendum, you mentioned that one of the problems we see is a kind of failure of EU cooperation, and really, I think maybe boils down to a failure of elite bargaining within these movements. So, like, how much is what we are seeing a failure, or just a complete failure of the elites in control and to kind of find the right tax rate or whatever, or is it truly kind of a nationalist or sentiment?
I think they go hand in hand, right? So, like, as elites fail to interconnect with the popular sentiment, you see the rise of populist movements. I think that was the tension we saw in 2016 too with the election. Part of the problem was it became a question of like who's more populist, right? And Hillary Clinton did not win that argument. There's no argument under which she can win that. Do you remember? I don't know if you guys remember. She came out. Trump kind of tapped into this like underground nationalist thing when he started rising. And her tactic, instead of saying, well, look, actually we don't have it that bad in the United States, maybe if you want status quo, you want more of Obama, you should vote for me, and then trying to play that base, she started saying she was an outsider too, because she was worried about Bernie Sanders. Do you remember that? Yeah. So I think that's another example.
In traditional politics, like the point of the elite is to manage these kind of.
In traditional political theory,
yeah. And so like, are we headed because of current conditions either in the internet or this new international order? Like, are we headed towards a point where elites can no longer like feasibly control or do they have the leverage anymore to make these bargains that prevent referendums and like violence that kind of order?
Not singly, I think. I was in a debate recently on some of these topics. It was on like it was a question of like who owns information. And so I forget the guy, he's someone with a post-grad degree in political economics, and he was trying to argue from a very conservative position that some of the tensions that we're talking about now, he saw it very much in that way, as just it's the market needs to be reset so that elites can handle control. My point then, I think, which I've reiterated now, is that I don't think it's possible for a single group of elites to control just because it's not possible to contain that much information. So you get some like I think pseudo-religious and crazy sentiments from guys like Elon Musk saying like, well, the singularity's coming and that'll fix everything. We're basically just going to have an overlord of AI. That seems like I said, pseudo-religious to me. That's like it's like waiting for some kind of god or to be able to fix the question for you. I think in terms of actual elites now, managing this data, can you imagine what it takes to regulate just a simple thing, let alone something like Google's selling of data? So like, for example, I do a lot of work in the e-cigarette sector now. The US is very, very bad. We're having an extremely hard time regulating e-cigarettes because the legislators just do not understand them. The FDA doesn't quite get them. It takes a lot of time for us to unravel them. So like, the question is, should you allow e-cigarettes to be treated differently than tobacco, like traditional tobacco? Well, the question underneath that is, are they as harmful as traditional tobacco, or do they lead people to quit tobacco? Who knows? It's going to take a while for scientists to reach a consensus, but then once scientists reach a consensus, then that has to trickle down into the popular conception, and once it trickles down to the popular conception, the politicians will pick up on it, and they'll mirror it back, and this is a process that could take 50 years or more. In the meantime, the technology is changing like every year, and so that if you imagine like policy happening in waves that are advancing on a beach, and just the distance between what the actual truth of the question is and what the policy regulations or at least understanding behind the policy regulations, because there's obviously a failure between what they actually understand and what they implement, and what they're able to negotiate, is then the distance is just like continually growing, so the tide is receding and receding and receding. But it's actually worse than that, because what's happening is then the beach is also actually moving in the other direction as the technology changes. And so it's just extremely, I would say almost impossible, yeah. That's just one sector.
That's like, to me, seems very familiar to you and Yuval Harari.
I love Yuval Harari.
Yeah, I mean, he says the same thing, that like, I mean, maybe you've probably pretty good stuff, but
yeah, I'm vaguely familiar. I've read some essays written and heard some.
But basically he says that, yeah, technology is advancing so fast that politics can't keep up with it.
Yeah.
But my question is like, so if this is gonna happen, like what is the solution? Like, should we have more intermingling between technology and politics? Like, do we have more regulation? Like,
I'm sorry, but I think that to have scientists in the governments.
Yeah, but that's kind of things that I'm saying. Like, what is the solution? Because this is something that I think we should definitely be thinking about. But I think a lot of people are missing. So, do you have any ideas, or anyone?
One of the things, because Harari actually also came to speak here, and he wrote this book called Homo Deus, which talks about kind of like AI, bioengineering, information technology, all kind of coming in and challenging humanism and what it is to be human. And yeah, so, but one of the things that he talked about was that perhaps democracy at its current form is not, well, he hinted at this, well, like it's not suitable to deal with these things. And I'm not sure, but it's like if you need international cooperation on this, because right, with bioengineering, all the ethics and stuff, if China's running ahead with it, and there's competition, but what about, so how do you even do that on an international level? It means like a whole new level of policy questions.
Yeah.
And we can barely do the classic ones.
For sure. It's definitely a huge daunting problem. I think that's something ultimately for you guys to look, because you guys are much more likely to be the next elite than I am. But I think, I would say, yeah, that's one possible answer is, which you seem to be hinting at, or Harari is that you need some kind of like technocratic republic.
That was
much
did you
differently.
get that? I kind of got that.
That's an answer. I don't know how good it is. I think ultimately, even within that system, you'd have to automate a lot of the processes, because the problem is you just can't process information fast enough to handle that. And if you do, then what you've done is, if you do automate a lot of the processes of government, then what you're doing is really weaponizing like ethical systems. And so like the question over driverless cars is a good one. There's an old trolley problem. You guys are philosophy, some guys on your right. You're familiar with the trolley problem? Let me give like a really dumbed down, stupid, if anyone wants to give a better one. So generally it's the first question, it's meant to show like a little tension. So in the way that our intuitions about these things and like how we think about them. So there's a train on tracks, you're at the lever, you can say, does it go to A or B? There's 3 people on one track and 1 person on the other. Would you be willing to switch it so that it kills the 1 and saves the 3? Assume you didn't know, let's assume you don't know the people for now. Most people say yes, it's a utilitarian way of thinking about this. Now let's change it a little bit. Let's say there's a train on the tracks, there's like 4 or 5 people down there, the way that you push a fat person in front, it'll somehow cause them to hit the fat person, slow down, and not kill the 5 down the road. Do you do that? Do you actively push them off? So that's like considered an esoteric question, kind of philosophy. It's hung around in philosophy forever. Driverless cars have kind of weaponized that, because you can code into the system such that the driverless car will automatically make distinctions when it's about to approach a crash or something. So the driverless car knows I can swerve off the right to kill my passenger, or I can swerve off to the left and it'll kill the other passenger in the car, for example, say something like that. Right, and it depends on your ethical system that you coded in, so, and what you're allowing the car to make the decision based on, because let's say you code in, we'll save the most lives. Okay, maybe there's a bus of elderly citizens, a school bus of children, and there's less children in the car than in the school bus.
If we're talking really ethical, there's a third choice, blow up the car. But no one would get in a car.
Precisely.
But, like, if that would save, like, if we're really talking utilitarian, right?
I think also didn't Germany say that they were going to preemptively ban that from being a possible solution, because they were worried about no one getting into the car.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. So, that's all questions.
Sorry. No.
Okay, I was just going to say that it seems like, contrasting this to our early discussion about Catalonia, I noticed then there seemed to be an absence of institutions in general. It was very much like a realistic tone underpinning our discussion of, what does Macron want, what does Figaro want. So, and then contrasting with this kind of technocratic worldview, it seems like there's a big gap.
Yeah.
in between those somewhere where it's purely rational. So I wonder, shifting that paradigm back to the Catalonian question, can you speak about the role of institutions in, as someone mentioned, like the self-determination question? It seems like that's where people should be able to appeal to laws and institutions rather than, leaders with whatever their subversive motives might be.
Sure. Speaking of subversive, that was a very subversive question. No, that's subversive is good.
It's
Yeah,
more
yeah.
cynical, I think, to think that institutions don't matter.
I think my defense of that would have to be, we're talking about projection into the future versus like what's going on the ground right now and doing like a historical analysis. So I personally don't think that the institutions matter that much. Now, that's obviously hugely debatable. I think the impact of the institutions had mostly to do with corruption within the institutions and with what I was trying to hint at earlier, which was that the EU itself had a kind of vested interest in this type of thing not getting off the ground. And so you have people like Macron rejecting out of hand because he's within this system. And so like the will of the system, so to speak, is to avoid cracking up from the inside.
But isn't that kind of the point of like the body of laws in the EU Code of Human Rights is also meant to balance against those individual motives?
Sure.
And is that totally absent?
Well, the question is, do they do it well, right? And I think I've hinted that I don't think any of them do it well. Like the UN can't even get non-proliferation or genocide prevention right, which seems like a non-negotiable thing from the institution's standpoint.
Where do we buff that up then? Is it?
So I think so they need to demonstrate that they're still supporting it in periods like this. It needs to be demonstrated, but I do understand that it's difficult. So speaking about should they release Puigdemont back or not?
Yeah.
So if they do, they're just clearly backing the EU as an institution, but there might be so the sort of value of human lives, so integrity will suffer, which is at the core of the EU's. So
sure. Well, I mean, and to her point too, that we're still talking about like individual motives within the system, not the system as like an indissoluble unit. But I think that's more useful personally on the journalistic side. Maybe someone else would do it better if you got in someone who specializes in institutional analysis or someone who's an expert in EU law. They would have something more interesting to say. I think just the reality on the ground, though, as opposed to what the EU says it's doing, is definitely better. But again, to use your example, if they decide not to release him back to Spain, that's an individual decision being made within this system, which I view as in turmoil right now. I don't think any of these systems are settled right now. I think they're in the middle of a regional crisis in Krakow, and I think you're seeing shifting away from big systems and towards little regional units. So you have like the rise of like G8, G20. You have like the exporting of problems facing the UN to like regional units. So you have like the AU, in Africa, the African Union, and IGAD, which are kind of tasked to deal with like the poverty of sub-Sahara and the crazy civil wars. And then you have like BRICS Bank and stuff in Latin America to solve the developmental problems. And the UN has just kind of become this like sputtering institution which continually changes its goals and justifies what it's doing. That's my view of it.
Could you just talk more about institutions, because you obviously believe they're broken and rotten. And I'm just wondering, because we kind of perhaps get more of a glorified view here at Stanford in terms of institution, right? I mean, like there's a school of thought here that's very strong, and it talks about institutions, democracy. So thoughts on that?
Anything specific? I could tell you my view is.
Is there hope?
Sure.
Or it's completely reboot. I don't know.
Sure. I think some of the structural problems we're talking about are just like not even solvable within the current institutional problems. So you would need to first be able to envision what changes you would have to make to the system, and I don't see any potential solutions right now. That doesn't mean there isn't any. It just means I lack the imagination to bring it forth at this moment. Generally, I do think I wouldn't say that they're totally dead. I just think there's like a tendency towards disorder and chaos in these systems. And so you would continually have to readjust in order to make these things right. I mean, part of the essay was, if you want to take a more institutional view of the whole crisis, part of the essay was to say actually, I think there's another underwriting historical tension in the international order. So at the systemic level of the UN, which is the question of the whole UN system, kind of evolved out of the Woodrow Wilson style question of like smiling beneficial imperialism. And that's like that's what this whole system is based on. I think that's invalid now. So you need a new system, and I think people like Harari will be important in like just based on what you said here in like reformulating how we think about that. But I think part of my view of like the nationalism, especially in the U.S., is that it really is like it's like a wink and like a yearning glance at this like lost imperialism of where you can unilaterally solve questions. And so you have guys like Bannon and Trump who are pushing for anti-globalism. They're saying we're going to bring back manufacturing. Trump gets up in front of the UN and says, well, what matters is national sovereignty, and everyone cheers, even though they hate him. And then at the same time, he starts increasing tension. I mean, it's not isolationism that they're pushing for internationally. That's my point. He starts increasing tensions with the Rocket Man, right, in North Korea. And he doesn't condemn Russia, for example, for any of its imperialist nonsense. And I think it's because secretly they want, not so secretly, they want to be able to throw their weight around a little more, but they can't. So it's becoming increasingly impotent, in my view.
So is the argument here that international institutions themselves are failing, but how do you, I mean, at the same time, how do you view national institutions? Like, are they, in your view, are they failing as well, or I guess especially from a European perspective?
I wouldn't say failing, I would say rotting. There's a difference. Like one's like testing the health of the international institutions, and the other is saying like their effect, right? So I don't know that their effect has been, I think it's getting increasingly impotent. So like if you look at any international crisis and you ask, well, what if the UN hadn't handled it? And I think that's becoming the case a lot. So like, I think if you look at like what they're doing in South Sudan, and you ask like, what's the actual net impact of the UN in this region versus IGAD or versus Ethiopia or Uganda or Kenya? And I think the answer is not much. They haven't done much good. Most of the reports, the internal reports released by the UN say stuff like in Malakal, there was a Malakal big massacre. There was a massacre of like a UN fort. And the report that was released by the inspection of the UN said that the people who were expecting, so this is a guarded refugee camp for the UN. They say, actually, the people who were expecting to be safe in this camp had unrealistic expectations, because what happened was when the rebels and the armed people came, the UN soldiers just disappeared, didn't fight, didn't protect them. And so that's my view of like generally like how it looks.
So earlier you argued that the as far as the international system currently is constructed, and specifically the UN, is on a new imperialist sort of structure. And so I wonder if you were to get rid of the Security Council or something like that, do you think that would be a better sort of system for governing the international system?
I think probably it will shift more towards rule like the G8 and G20, but I think if you're going to have the Security Council, you have to expand it, especially if you're claiming it's based on a democratic basis. You have to include people like India.
But if you're expanding Security Council, are you also expanding the veto rights, or are they still closer to the same number?
Yeah, I think the veto system needs to be changed too. It would need to be maybe a majority. No, maybe a majority of Security Council members or something. Maybe not totally eliminated, because then you have too much chaos. But then you have the same system just with like no efficiency whatsoever. But I think definitely if you included a couple of democratic populous areas like India, for example, which is a good one.
So are you saying increase the number of countries with the veto rights?
Yeah, increase the Security Council, and then also change the system of the veto rights. So not one country can veto, but it takes a majority of Security Council members to veto any given measure, because that'll even it out a little bit, and that's like a step towards something I think better for sure.
Has the UN itself played any role in the Catalan crisis as it stands today?
Not really, not that I'm aware of. I would say.
You've released statements from the president saying.
Right. It's the same thing. They're I think. So my view on this is that they're leaving it to be an internal European matter. I don't know if that would have been true if this wasn't happening in Europe. There would have been stronger actions taken. And I think that's the view of most internationals who are not from Europe that I've talked to. And so I think whatever the UN has done is basically pushed it back, like tacitly back. The EU, which is basically back Madrid, so they're going to have to reapply, and they've strongly indicated that that's going to be what's going to happen, because I think they have a vested interest in keeping the region unified, especially as you see the growth of other regions economically, which are competition to this kind of system, which is supposed to be based on regional imperialism.
Okay, but you made it clear that the EU would require Catalonia to reapply for sponsorship, and so if that's the case, why do you think the push for independence still remains so strong?
Well, I mean, partially, like I said, anytime you have someone, so Catalonia, even those who wouldn't have voted for it had like a strong idea of independence, at least as they explain it. It has a very long overarching history of independence. So anytime you have an actor which is seen kind of as an outside actor come in and dissolve parliament, that's not okay. I think the tensions there are obvious, and that there are obvious economic incentives not to vote for it, but there's now a strong moral case that was made by Spain, not by Catalonia, for Catalan secession. Got it.
Yeah, this is true. When I was a child, so nobody was independent. So you can, maybe once in your class, had the flag, or nobody was caring about. But then when we asked for you said more autonomy, and they just rejected it, even if we had voted it in 2006, it was like, what? So what are you doing? I mean, we voted for it, for a little bit of more autonomy, like another region in Spain, like País Basque. So, and we asked for the same of the other region, and you say no. So, and then all started.
But it wasn't just more autonomy. It also Catalonia also classified itself as a nation.
Yeah.
And
in the referendum.
Yeah, no, not in the referendum. In 2006,
yeah.
The wording was that Catalonia would be a nation.
When we voted it, then it was accepted for the government. But then the right party that is there, they took it to the constitutional tribunal, and they rejected it. So, but I mean, there was an agreement in that moment, but they just said no in the end, even if we had voted it.
It wasn't an agreement, it was a declaration by Catalonian...
Well, it was an adoption of resolutions. I think my kind of counter-argument some of this against some of the Spanish Constitution is that the understanding, if I was a Catalonian, the understanding of the 78 Constitution, which is what underpins the entire Spanish side, was that that there would be chances to move towards more independence, because you have immediately the 79 autonomy of Catalonia. And so 2006 would have been, like I said, like a spit in my eye, because the first time we attempt to move it, you don't really negotiate. You don't view it as an opening bid and some kind of like negotiation where you remain in Spain, but maybe we take a little less taxes. Or that we allow you to privilege the Catalan language in the region. You just kind of reject it out of hand, and so that definitely galvanizes, I think.
Can I also just ask everyone, I'll just hand this around to your email addresses and your numbers down just for the future.
Then I also want to ask, or discuss, moving forward in the Catalonia issue. I think Catalonia, and I think most people would agree with me here, Catalonia has a moral claim, a good claim for independence. Morally, ethically speaking, Catalonia should be independent.
Yeah.
But regrettably, international politics do not work that way. And as the status quo is that Spain has rule over Catalonia, why would it let that go against its own interests? And I can only think of two reasons: economic and military. Catalonia does not have the military to oppose Spain. And since there won't be any outside military involvement in that issue, I don't see military taking a role in Catalonian independence. Then there's the financial, there is a financial argument of why Spain could let Catalonia go. And national and international. So national financial retributions could be Catalonia refusing to pay taxes. But then again, that would result in military involvement, I guess. What's your point?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that? But what could be financial sanctions, national or international, that could compel Spain to let Catalonia go? So if we reverse engineer the situation, saying okay, for Catalonia to gain its independence, what should the international community or what should the Catalonian community do?
Yeah, so I think the only hope that pro-independence people have would be to get some other European country to back their play, which just hasn't happened. I mean, even Belgium hasn't totally backed them. They're offering kind of sort of sanction right now, but not really, because they're reviewing the warrant. Yeah, it's like putting it off, right? So I think they're waiting to see how the vote turns out.
Also, don't the European Union have rules against sanctioning each other?
Yeah, so you couldn't sanction, you wouldn't have a sanction, but if Catalonia got, that's not what I'm saying, if Catalonia got to back move somewhere, like a couple of states in the Eurozone that could put pressure, enough, I think, political pressure on Spain, to do it, but I just don't see what their chances are, especially since you have leadership pushing this, going up and saying, well, actually, we didn't want to belong to the Eurozone after all. I think that was a huge tactical mistake.
So I guess realistically, we are just not seeing Catalonian independence.
I think probably not this time, but like I said, I think the question is not resolved in Spain's favor. This is seen as resetting, but it's like giving cough syrup to like a headache.
Symptoms of like something big. Like I wonder when we're looking back. Like I'm really interested in history, but I wonder when we look back at this time, what we'll say it's the beginning of, or what it was. This because it's clear something is going on. I don't have enough. Like we're very disciplinary, and I don't have enough knowledge of like to exactly put it together,
Sure.
or a vision of the future for them.
Yeah, I think the closest thing you can find right now, I found some comparisons. So I think there were some comparisons made between Yugoslavia and this. I don't think it's that at all. Because first of all, it's a peaceful protest, not a violent revolution. There is no military, for example, so this can't be Yugoslavia. I think it's almost like an anti-Arab Spring moment for Europe right now, especially if it takes off. If Spain's right, then this reset goes their way, then what will happen is, they think, is that the wind will kind of be knocked out of this, and then it'll just put it down for a while. Now that's possible, but it's also possible that it'll just pop up somewhere else, like Lombardy or Pico, where it's not unconstitutional and where it could pass. And then you'll see the reinstitution of the Scottish referendum, maybe, something like that.
Nicola Sturgeon came here and said they want to do it again.
Yeah.
When I'm surprised.
They all want to. They're just, the question for them is like, can we succeed?
Yeah.
So I think that England and Scotland, so England proposed a project for Scottish. So they say, no, don't go. I will do that for you. So this. Spain didn't do anything. So I mean, they are not proposing any project of country for me. I don't feel that I'm.
But would that convince you?
Yes, why not? So the first step, so we don't woke up and we said, okay, we are going to be independent. So it was a process and we just tried to figure out what was that would be
Why
there.
are you so scared? Like just in terms of
Because
language?
I think that it's an historian matter. We came from, the government that we have, they come from a dictatorship, from people who were supporting the dictatorship. They didn't die. Because Franco died in bed. So this is, I think, the first problem that we had, that we, after he died, we got an agreement because we had to. But people who now is in the government, they are descendants of that right fascism. And they have demonstrated it with their acts. So I cannot see myself in that country as my views and a lot of people in the rest of Spain as well.
Right? Like
No, I don't mind. I know that if we get independent, we are going to suffer a lot of years because it's what it is. But I don't know, maybe we can do it better. Maybe we'll have 10 years, 20 years of recession, everything will be a shit. I cannot work as a scientist maybe, but I don't know, maybe we can do it
You're
in
not the only
another
one
way.
of the region who's feeling that way. I mean, it's like again and again we see this.
Yeah.
Despite economic.
Yeah, this is why I think the Arab Spring is the right metaphor, because like, what's the difference between the countries in the Middle East that survived the Arab Spring and the ones that didn't? And usually, if you look at places like Jordan, which did pretty well,
Strong.
they negotiated, and so the ones that negotiated, in this case, would be the UK. The one that decided to clamp down would be Spain. And so it's a peaceful version of the same thing. It's not as violent.
But would it be negotiation or like strong governments that just don't give no traction to it?
Well, that's
For example, Al Jazeera, when they didn't show protests in, where, one of the Gulf countries. Like there were places where there were protests and they just didn't show.
Yeah, for Al Jazeera, it was probably UAE, right? They didn't show.
Is it? Oman?
Qatar or something like that. Oman, yeah.
You are the protest movement.
No, don't listen to me. I don't remember. I'm not trying to start conspiracy theories. I don't remember.
I feel like Oman is like one country where they're truly happy with their like king. I'm almost like never heard
it's
anything
definitely not.
negative about Oman's king from the people.
Great.
Well, I wanted to ask about what is your opinion about the. I don't know.
Yeah, of course,
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, because I'm seeing that now a lot of right extremist fascist groups are demonstrating in Spain, but I mean.
Flying the flag of Franco.
Yes, and I mean in Spain, but I suppose that this wave of right, it's just making someone else in other countries just to to kind of do the same if they want, or just to get more power in the countries. And I think I'm surprised that the European Union doesn't see it as a threat. They're like, okay, we should do something. We cannot let the fascist people just go through the streets and nobody caring about. I mean, I don't want to kill them, but just do something. I mean, because we know what happened.
Definitely.
It happened.
And
Germany knows.
I would also point out that there's been clashes between fascists and anti-fascists in around Europe as well as in America. Once we're in Berkeley, right, for example, you have the people flying the communist flag and then these like pseudo-fascist groups.
Because people are so worried about that if we get independence, everybody will be independent, but nobody is saying if we let these right parties going on, there will be
Some
others.
people are starting to say that though, right? So this morning I saw an article, I think it was Al Jazeera, maybe the Telegraph, which was explaining this exact
I mean,
thing, saying,
from my point of view, it's more worrying that situation that if anybody wants to be independent, well, it's something.
Yeah.
But, it has these issues, but this other thing, I don't know. But, yeah, what do you think, Maria?
I think, no, it's good. I think the memory of a lot of the 20th century stuff has been like so distorted at this point it's meaningless. So like if I'm called a Nazi or something, like someone calls you a communist or a Nazi, it like doesn't mean anything. It's like totally trivial. It just means I don't like what you're saying. Like shut up. Like I hate you. Go away. It's not at all connected to what it would mean to actually be Franco. So that means you can have people flying an actual Franco flag or a Nazi flag in America. Or the communist flag. I mean, I think I'm right in saying some of the anti-fascist protests in America have been throwing the communist flags. Well, the communists murdered just as many people, if not more than Hitler. So, like, what are you standing for? Like, are you not pro-genocide? You're just anti what German genocide or something? German-led genocide. So I think there's definitely a disconnection between the fascism question versus the non-fascism. And I also think there's a lot of dissatisfied people. I think definitely with a lot of the economic boons and wanes that have been going on in the last few years all over, the entire West has been racked. I mean, in addition to all the structural problems we talked about with like bad economics, and that just like activates these like seething tensions.
But I also think that's a bigger problem than maybe comparing only Europe and the US is far bigger problem.
Yeah.
In German or in Czech, in the Czech language, there's a saying that there's a sort of predatory capitalism in the U.S. where no one really cares about another. And so in Germany, the quality of life of someone who is not it's fine. I think people have free time. People have 6 weeks of mandatory holidays per year. It's not the case in the U.S.
Yeah, well, that's another institutional problem too, though, right? So like. In the U.S., 5% would be unemployment, so that's people who want a job and can't get a job would be considered phenomenal, like unheard of good. But that still means you have 5% people that are, so you always have dissatisfaction. For sure, I think it's a bigger problem in the U.S. for the moment. We'll see where it goes. The New York Times just got in trouble this last week for running an article that seemed to like normalize hate. Yes, they wrote an article about I forget the gentleman or not the gentleman.
He was a nice Nazi or something.
His name, yeah.
Like a shy or whatever.
I mean, a lot of people didn't know this, but the Nazis there's actually branches of the Nazis which were trying to recruit ethnic minorities for a while. Like 5 or 10 years ago, they had like opened up their membership, just like rebrand the whole thing. So like hate or Nazism has a glossy new website, right? It's the same idea, but like. We'll make friends for a little bit when we have to, strategically, right? It's very hypocritical, but yeah, that's what they're trying to show. They're trying to show the tension, like, oh, he's just kind of a normal guy, and that's what's like really terrifying. The whole point of like the 20th century was like, yeah, you probably would have been a fascist or a Nazi too. Like, there's a lot of fascist sympathizers in America. Had you been born there in Germany, you probably would be too. I think the way that we're handling this is not so good. First of all, we don't really know how to handle speech. We're kind of confused about it. It doesn't count as violence. Does not count as violence. What are the limits of speech? What's hate speech? What's included in hate speech? And these are like definitions which are all malleable. So like Canada considers C-16, right? So they consider transphobia to be hate speech. The U.S. doesn't recognize hate speech, really. I mean, with a few exceptions. In Germany or something like that, you can't even fly Hitler. Like
it's illegal.
Yeah, I think someone's being prosecuted right now, right? Who was an Auschwitz guard. He's like 93.
No, that was, as far as I can tell,
a couple years ago.
It was like 6 years ago. And actually, it is quite concerning how the German government is kind of covering it up. So often governments from outside Germany would, there's people, also private people, who notice that there is someone who had a key sort of role in the system, and they even photograph the people, and then send it to the German government, and the German government tends to play these things down. They tend to almost deny that that person is still alive. They basically look for ways to
I mean, think about like that set. I mean, I was just thinking about how to make peace with your nationalism in your past. Like Germany is, like, how do they? It's amazing. Like, I mean, is
but
there?
also, it's already more than two. I don't know how long a generation counts, but it's quite a lot after. And I think that after the end of our generation, I think it's basically. I think these things just quiet down. Time really. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I think I'm observing that. I think that in one generation,
So what will happen?
the significance of this recent past will just go down significantly.
I think it's kind of already dead, right? Like
I think so
we
too.
were,
Yeah.
speaking for myself, I was barely born in the 20th century by like a handful of years. So like the cultural memory of that, don't know anyone who fought in World War II, barely know people who were alive.
But people just, basically now they would be 95, 100 years old. And
Yeah, and that's one of the measures that's like, to say that historical event is recent or not, so that is anybody alive in the world witnessed it?
Yeah.
And like in 10, 15 years, no one would have witnessed
already,
it.
basically.
I think that's right, and I think this plays all into both the legacy of genocide. Like, I mean, you heard the phrase, how often was the phrase "never again" bandied about after World War II? So let's see. In the last few years, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, South Africa, see what I'm saying? There's this whole host of genocide. So I think even the institutional and political memory is gone, as well as the personal memory. These things have no impact, and I think Gorbachev might say something like the United States of amnesia, we're like particularly good at forgetting things.
Well, you opened the talk by saying, I think this nationalist movement is not unpreventable. Some people say it's not preventable. I disagree. That's what you said. So, okay, like, how do we make sure that it actually never happens again?
Yeah, I don't know about never happening again. I think there's definitely a way to move past it, but generally, I mean, you're always going to have pockets of people. I think you can marginalize those. So the thing for me, the big test case for me is like is the narrative at the narrative level. So like, I talk a little bit before I think about how I think like the body metaphor works really well for nation state. I think nation state's a very natural metaphor, and it's something that we're used to and comfortable with, and we understand it at like the instinctual level. No one really gets globalism, and there's like no compelling narrative that they can offer. So like the question for the UN right now is still like kind of attached to these nation states. They base their story on the stories of national sovereignty, right? That's what they're kind of from. And so you need a competing narrative, and I haven't heard one yet. I think probably increased efficiency and things will help, right? If you can make a case that you're seriously eradicating poverty, that you're seriously ending genocide and things like that, which are the UN goals supposedly, and you at least have some backing to make the case, but you still need like a story, something interesting to say, like, this is why we're different from the nation-state model, and this is why you should prefer that. Give that a couple of generations, and then like no one's going to want to revert backwards to something like a national sovereignty model, which will seem barbaric by contrast.
So what do you mean exactly by national sovereignty model and the globalist model? Just so I'm sure that I'm exactly
sure. Well, so in terms of national sovereignty, I think a lot of the globalism that we see is actually built on national sovereignty, so it's like built on the back of it, piggybacked on it. So the national sovereignty story, so to speak, is that people have the right to self-determination, which is determined through the state, and it usually has like an ethnic or cultural component. So Catalans, there's the language, they have this pre-existent separation from Spain, which actually predates Spain, and that's driving, like someone was asking earlier why I thought it was so persistent. Like that's definitely feeding into that. And so I think what you need but don't have is something on the global side that's equally persuasive. And what you have right now is just not to cooperate. I think you need like a gut level story. Well, I think ultimately you need to drift away from that. Yeah.
Because you were saying that the nation-state story or nationalism is very obvious and inherent, and
well, I think it's natural. I don't think that means it's good.
Yeah, no, also if you look at the literature, there's not a lot, like when you look into nationalism, you try to find the thinker, like Rousseau, or like there's not. It's like
Sorry, the big countries are nationalist.
Yeah.
it's a problem of organization. And another thing is I want to say to you is Spain is a very poverty suit of Europe and has very much aid, economic aid of Europe. When Europe stopped the aid, the Spain pretend to live with the money of Catalonia, but without equal relationship. This is the statute of 2010. And it's for this is conflict now, because Catalonia say, no, we can to don all money without dialogue, without supervision. This is the problem. And the independent is very few people. Only we pray for one referendum. But no, the legal, the police is the stupidity, the political stupidity from the Spain. And now is not official independence, because it's not right in official book. It's like a broma, ¿cómo se digo?
Joke.
Like a joke for both parts. Ni Spain is terrible on the Catalonia, ni Catalonia is the true independent. You know, it's like no sé if you agree with this vision or not, or is one part of it. It's not totally the explanation, but I think that is the local explanation.
Yeah.
Because we are the cousins, the primos. We are the people, is the familiar people,
Yeah.
no? No sé, I want to report this.
No, and I definitely think that plays into it. And there's some obvious parallels in the way the process plays out. So like, I think that was definitely something that we've seen similar in other regional separations that have just been handled. I think Spain did. Like I've been saying, I think Spain did mishandle the situation. But I think that's definitely how the natural outgrowth comes from, like the Catalan perspective, for sure.
It's for that independence low the pressure and say, no, only with economical arrange we will go more or less, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. I would point out too that that's just kind of like how movements are driven, right? So there's usually a slow trickle which then grows into like a building stream. So you have like Brexit, for example, was like a tiny minority, I think a smaller minority than the referendum, and they just keep handing away for years and years, and then eventually situations globally matched and made their argument very strong. And I think the same was true in the US with the right. You had these elements, I heard people saying things like Trump for years, for decades, yeah. Oh, especially where I grew up in California, which is like SoCal. It's like it's a more impoverished area than this. A lot of Trump supporters, they were saying the same things forever. The Mexicans are economy, look, it's unstable, we want to secure the border. So they have all these issues, they don't really take off because they're not really popular, they're small.
It just kind of aligns.
Situations on the ground make it much more relevant, and it makes them seem, even if they weren't like prescient, forward-looking. So like Trump comes up and says he condemns. He makes that famous speech saying, like, compares the bird and rapists, right? It was a terrible speech, the famous moment where he comes down the gilded escalator, they're bringing rapists. They're bringing the criminals. You have that happen, and then you have at the same time going what made it relevant, the difference for me, the historical event that makes that relevant as opposed to irrelevant. And like crazy, because he's been doing this conspiracy stick for a few years now. He was way into the Obama birther thing. Was that you have things like the migrant crisis going on. So if I'm like an average American looking at the news, what do I turn on? I see, oh, there's a refugee crisis and migrant crisis and economic crisis is in Europe, so they're suffering from the same thing. We've got to secure the borders. We got to bring back our right to self-determination, which is what they view that as. We got to bring back the old school manufacturing jobs.
Okay, so Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.